am Isabella Moggs from the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy, and today I will be interviewing Timo Kivimaki about the subject of peace and conflict building, especially in relation to humanitarian interventions and the role nonviolence can play in this. Timo Kivimaki is a professor of international relations at the University of Bath in the United Kingdom. He does research on peace and conflicts and has tried to help peace processes also in practice. He has helped 11 governments in their efforts at peace by doing analysis and capacity building when they prepare for peace negotiations or designing their strategies of conflict prevention. He was the advisor to the former President of Finland, Mr. Martti Ahtisaari, in his mediation of the Aceh Peace Talks, for which President Ahtisaari earned his Nobel Peace Prize. Under Indonesia's Vice President, Jusuf Kalla, Professor Kivimaki initiated, together with an Indonesian professor, the peace process between ethnic groups in West Kalimantan in Indonesia. So your work focuses on peace and conflict studies and interventions in fragile states. What inspired you to follow this line of research and work?
Well, this is my current area of interest, and it is mainly because the fact that 98% of conflict fatalities are produced in countries that we classified as fragile. So this fragile states question is at the core kind of fatalities of current times, fatalities of organized violence in these conflicts take place only after we outsiders have intervened in these conflicts, basically to protect civilians or punish perpetrators, such as terrorists and dictators for violence against civilians. So it seems clear that we need to clarify on how to intervene and what to do and how not to intervene to protect people from organized violence.
So I found your publication, The Failure to Protect, The Path to and Consequences of Humanitarian Interventionism, very insightful into the impact and the extent of the effectiveness of humanitarian interventions into fragile states, and the role that soft power and nonviolent approaches can play in the place of these militaristic approaches. In the book, you discuss the paradoxes of protection in new wars. Could you please explain these paradoxes?
Well, the main motivate rather than de-escalate. My study showed that during the first year of intervention, conflict fatalities tend to go up more than 7-fold. And even though the intention is to bring down violence, however, my new book, which will come out in next month, May 2021, it shows that the United Nations does it better. Fatalities are brought effectively down in almost all UN peacekeeping operations. So even though our media often describes UN operations as ineffective and assumes that unilateral great powers interventions are needed because of the lack of effectiveness of the UN, the truth is that UN approach, which is often much less militaristic, more kind of compassionate and more development oriented, that such operations actually manage to tackle organized violence in fragile states.
So following on from that, non-intervention is argued as realists as being the long-term solution for stability and peace in fragile states. And this is following the argument that violence is necessary in the early stages of state building. On the other hand, there is the argument that force should be used to block violent opportunities from furthering conflicts, and that humanitarian interventions are important to re-establish a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence. Following from what you've just said, what are your thoughts on how is the best way to balance these approaches, or the best approach to this to reduce conflict fatalities in interventions?
Yeah, I think the standard cosmopolitan interventionist thinking is wrong because it focuses on good intentions. And they often neglect consequences of intervention. So that's where I think the current political thinking is wrong. But I think realists often feel that nothing can conflict in fragile states, and I think that's wrong too. I think, yeah, legitimate representative agents like the UN, they can do things. They can keep conflicting parties from each other, and if they respect the right of conflicting parties to find their own local solutions to their own conflicts, I think they often manage to solve, help solve the situation. So also, furthermore, there seems to be a strong association between UN focus on developmental human security and the success of UN peacekeeping. So basically, also violence can be reduced if we tackle the real problems and care about the people in conflicts, rather than seeing conflicts as something where we have to find the bad guys that needs to be punished. So I think we should be focusing on related to poverty and economic insecurities. I don't think it is useful to tackle and try to deal with conflict violence by simply punishing the bad guys and thinking that there are just bad guys and good guys. It's much more complicated, and we need much more compassion to deal with conflicts.
So would you agree then that there's a need in state building and in interventions for a much more human security versus traditional security approach? And also, studies have shown that women's inclusion in conflict and peace building has significantly increased sustainability of peace. And I suppose we're taking a more feminist approach to these interventions. And as you have just said, human security, could this reduce the need for the violent force in the early stages of state building that other theories have suggested is necessary?
I think actually, even though I don't want to kind of think that there's a feminist or feminine approach to conflicts, but I would say that there's this fallacy, there's this understanding that conflicts and security has to be dealt with in a very stereotypical masculine way, and that's simply wrong. I think you're right in the sense that that approach is stereotypically masculine. In reality, they are often counterproductive. I've revealed this actually by looking at the association in time and operations between masculine language and conflict fatalities. So it seems quite clear on the basis of very actually robust quantitative analysis that stereotypical powerful approaches are counterproductive. They increase the number of fatalities rather than kind of bring conflicts down. Yet I do think states need law enforcement, but I think they need it only once there is consensus on what the law and norms are. In the international community, we often think that whatever we believe is the norm or the law applies, and then we start enforcing our understanding of the norm, and that's where it goes wrong. That's where our approach is I think too stereotypically masculine. Now, before we will have to have, before enforcing anything, we will have to have dialogue on what kind of norms we want there to exist, and simply imposing on our norms on others is what often explains why humanitarian interventions have been so inhumane. It also explains why UN is better than great powers in their efforts at reducing organized violence. UN tends to negotiate, whereas unilateral powers often tend to demonize conflicting parties, demonize their enemies, and the negotiating approach works, whereas the demonizing approach doesn't work. And I think this is also why stereotypical masculine approaches do not work, why we men are assumed to favor kind of robust means and decisive solutions, and that's exactly what doesn't work. So that's why we do need women, and we do need to get rid of this all stereotypical masculine approach to conflicts. We need softer approaches.
Yes, I agree with this. And you've also discussed in your works, so moving on from that, the idea of the power-centric discourse. So what you have just said, and how the UN has started to move away from this, and how important it is to move away from this. Do you have any examples of discourse that has succeeded in moving away from this? What the alternative is?
I mean, the first example, of course, is the fact that the UN negotiates endlessly. And if you negotiate endlessly, you kind of respect the views and values of the others, rather than imposing your own values. And then what I often mean power centricity is I mean that if I think that in order to resolve a conflict, your behavior needs to change, and I need to use power to change your behavior. That's what normally doesn't work, because obviously if both sides feel that way, they just impose their views on others. Whereas the UN approach is negotiating, and that approach is in that sense less power centric, because it respects. It respects the others and their views, and it's also I mean, there's also a very strong correlation between the ways, in operations where UN focuses on development, for example, there it focuses on what they can help conflicting parties with, what they can help. That means they want to change their own behavior first, how to help the situation, and that works better, not just in saving lives from poverty, but also saving lives from violence.
Okay, and I suppose it relates to moving away from the power-centric discourse and more towards an understanding. But looking at the concept of cultural diplomacy, which is the practice of the exchange of ideas, values, traditions, and other cultural aspects in order to enhance intercultural cooperation and to promote national interests. And this has been identified as increasingly important in our globalized world and a useful tool of soft power in peace building. To what extent do you believe that promoting intercultural diplomacy between groups who are involved in interstate conflicts can be effective at peace building? And in what ways could intervening powers help to facilitate this in place of simply imposing values?
Well, I think dialogue between cultures and countries and religious groups or conflicting parties is what respects people with their own efforts at peace, and thus I think it's the only way to peace and progress. Peace is always relational. It's always about my relationship with somebody else, and we cannot have peace by looking at our own security only. We need that interaction. And this is also why the UN succeeds. It aims at separating conflicting parties in order to facilitate their interaction and their non-violent dialogue. So this is something civil society organizations can do. Promoting dialogue does help peace.
And on that note, often an issue with interventions is legitimacy. And this is partially related to the colonialist imperialist legacy of intervening powers and a mistrust that accompanies it. Would you think that by promoting cultural diplomacy, not only between groups within the conflict, but also between the Western powers and the fragile states, could this bring more legitimacy to humanitarian interventions and humanitarian aid missions?
Well, I think it's different between humanitarian interventions and military interventions and aid interventions. I think cultural diplomacy is necessary, but not for the winning of the hearts and minds, because we shouldn't want to win the hearts and mind for us. I think it's better to think of cultural diplomacy as mutual learning, that we also learn, because basically, clearly, if we Western people need to, if, for example, our humanitarian interventions have increased fatalities sevenfold, then clearly we haven't understood the countries that we operate in. So we need to learn as well. So I support cultural diplomacy between us Westerners and the fragile states, but not so that it is for us to win them over in a colonialistic manner, as was mentioned, but rather so that we can learn from each other. So,
yeah, I think that's a really important point. And to sort of summarize, so from your vast knowledge and experience in this field, to what extent do you think that in our current global political reality, the soft power, non-violent means of conflict and peace building have the potential to overtake these militaristic approaches as a response to armed conflicts and human rights atrocities?
I normally don't predict, because of the fact that predicting is difficult, especially predicting the future is very difficult. But the thing is that obviously it also depends what we want. I would be very optimistic about the potential. If we move to softer means, we will be more effective. But will we move depends on big powers, and I don't see it right now. We make so. I think what we can do at this stage is that the scientific knowledge that we have, and we can produce more of that scientific knowledge. That does show that it's more beneficial to do non-military things, to do cultural diplomacy, to do interaction rather than intervention. But whether countries, big powers, want to do that is up to them, and they should.
So, would there be any key steps that, in your opinion, everyone involved in these conflicts need to take for that to be a possibility, for them to move away from these violent approaches?
I think so. Yeah, I think. I've thought of my own role as a scholar. I think we do need to produce evidence and produce evidence of the benefits of nonviolent action, because it seems that that is clearly the case. It is then the task of others, like the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy, to promote this knowledge and translate it, this theory that we universities produce into practice and into reality.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time today and for this really insightful discussion about this topic, into how we can bring more diplomacy and nonviolent approaches into these issues. So thank you.
Thanks, Bella.